You know, you can walk through the Chinatowns of so many American cities and see these buildings that seem, well, steeped in history, holding untold stories.
Absolutely. So much history there.
And some of those stories, as we're about to find out, involve an organization with a history that's way more layered than you might think at first glance.
Mhm.
We're diving into the Hipsing Association today. Its Cantonese name, its Cantonese name, Hipsing Gumwi, translates roughly to cooperating for success, which, well, that phrase gets complicated fast when you look at their past.
It really does.
Mm.
And our exploration today kind of hinges on this insightful article excerpt we've got. It really lays out the journey of the Hipsing Association, the HSA.
Right.
It lets us sort of track its course, from the early 20th century right up to now, and reveals some, frankly, unexpected twists.
So the idea is to really get under the surface, move past simple labels, and understand its role, which seems pretty complex, sometimes surprising, within Chinese American communities.
Exactly. Unpacking that multifaceted history is the goal here.
Okay, so let's get into the basics. Where and when did it start? The source points to New York City's Chinatown, early 1900s, maybe around 1904.
That's the spot, early 20th century. And interestingly, it wasn't initially called the Association.
Oh.
It started as the Hipsing Tong.
Hip Sing Tong. Okay, what's the difference? Why Tong first?
Well, that initial name, Tom,
Hmm.
it really points to its original function. It was basically a labor organization.
Ah, okay.
The switch to association later on, that might suggest, a change in focus or maybe just make it sound more formal over time. But the key thing is the why. Why did it form in the first place?
Right. Like other Tongs, presumably.
Precisely. The HSA, like many others, primarily came about because its members needed protection.
Protection from what specifically? Was it internal stuff or?
Mostly external initially. Protection from the really widespread and often harsh anti-Chinese prejudice in the broader European American society back then.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and when the official systems, police, courts, were either unreliable or sometimes openly hostile to the Chinese community.
These groups had to step in.
Exactly. Organizations like the Hipsing Tong filled that gap. They offered a community structure, a way to handle internal disputes, basically a form of self-governance because the outside world wasn't helping.
So it was about mutual support, but also a reaction to society failing them.
That's the bedrock of it, yeah.
Yeah.
This deep need for protection and community support.
Okay, but then our source says, like a lot of Tongs, Hipsing got involved in vice activities to raise money. That seems like a pretty big shift from just mutual aid.
It was a huge shift,
Yeah.
definitely problematic. But you have to remember the context. They
Hmm.
were facing all this discrimination, couldn't easily access banks or legal help. So these illicit businesses, gambling, maybe opium dens, they seemed like maybe the only way to fund those essential community functions they were providing.
So less about pure greed and more about survival, funding their own safety net.
In many ways, yes. It was kind of a perverse situation where illegal activities funded vital community roles because the legitimate paths were blocked, but that unfortunately paved the way for serious violence.
The Tong Wars.
The Tong Wars, exactly.
And Hipsing was apparently a major player in those wars, clashing with groups like the Four Brothers and the Onleong Tong. Sounds like a really rough time in Chinatown.
Oh, incredibly volatile. Decades of violence in the early 1900s. These groups were fighting for control, for territory, for dominance over the rackets.
And the source mentions their rivalry with Onleong Tong was particularly fierce in New York, but didn't Hipsing actually start somewhere else?
Good point. Yeah, while the New York fight with An Leong is famous, Hipsing actually originated out on the West Coast,
Yeah.
San Francisco, before they moved east in the late 1800s.
Huh. So they had roots elsewhere first.
Suggests a potentially wider reach early on.
And in New York, this character emerges, Cy Wing Mock, known as Mock Duck.
The Mock Duck. Yeah.
Quite the nickname. He was leading the charge against the Onleong Tong.
Definitely a central figure. Mock Duck really shaped Hipsing's path in New York during those turbulent Tong War years. But their involvement in crime didn't stop with local vice and gang wars.
Oh. What came next?
Well, the source moves us into the mid-20th century, the 1930s and 40s, and reveals connections to something much bigger, international drug trafficking.
Whoa, okay. Drug trafficking. And it mentions partnerships with the Kuomintang, the KMT, and later the OPC, the Office of Policy Coordination. That sounds like government-level stuff almost.
It's pretty startling, isn't it? It suggests this complex intersection of organized crime, politics, maybe even intelligence operations.
How would those alliances even come about?
Well, building on the networks they already had from the Tong Wars, maybe these partnerships could offer resources protection, maybe help expand their reach. And they did expand. The source notes chapters popping up in other big cities with Chinese-American communities, Chicago, Seattle, San
Well,
Francisco.
I remember seeing that list.
And that big drug raid in San Francisco back in '96, that really drives home how deep and long-lasting that involvement was.
So we go from local protection to vice to tongue wars to this nationwide, even international drug network. But then the story shifts again. Apparently, more recently, say the last 50, 60 years, there's been an effort to clean up their image.
Yeah, a definite push towards legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it. But how they did it is interesting.
Oh, so?
The source talks about this tactic of basically using associated street gangs for the dirty work, like the Flying Dragons in New York City were mentioned.
Outsourcing the illegal stuff. Plausible deniability for the main group.
Pretty much. A way to keep the illegal income flowing while the main HSA tries to look respectable.
But did that last? The source seemed to suggest those ties got weaker, maybe even broken by the mid-90s.
It seems like it.
Yeah.
Probably a mix of things. More police pressure, maybe changes inside the HSA, leaders realizing that gang ties weren't helping their image goals. And since the late 90s, you do see this clearer trend, at least in some branches, towards becoming more like legitimate fraternal organizations. Kind of going back to the community roots, but in a totally different world.
And the New York City chapter is the prime example of that positive shift.
Absolutely. It's a stark contrast. They're part of the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, the CCBA. An HSA officer, Eric Eng, even became the CCBA president.
Wow.
And under him, the focus was apparently on outreach, cooperation. The source even mentions NYPD folks regularly showing up at CCBA events, talking community issues with HSA and CCBA members.
That sounds worlds away from tongue wars and drug rings.
It really does. It suggests a real effort at integration, working within the system.
Right.
But, and this is a big but,
It's not the whole picture.
not even close. That positive New York story isn't everywhere. The source flags the Chicago Police Department as recently as 2018, basically saying no comment about their local HSA because of ongoing gang investigations.
Oh, so?
And then there was that major anti-drug raid on the Portland branch in 2012.
So it's really uneven. Some seem to be going straight, others not so much.
Exactly. It's fragmented. And the source stresses how secretive the HSA is overall and how much autonomy each chapter has. That makes it incredibly hard to say definitively the HSA is like this now.
Because the HSA might mean something very different in New York versus Chicago or Portland.
Precisely. That decentralized structure lets them evolve in very different ways. Add the secrecy, and yeah, it's tough to get a clear overall picture.
The deep dive also dropped a few other names connected to the HSA. Besides Mokduk, there was Kai Su, Benyong,
Benyong, yeah.
Dijon, and Wari Charles. The source didn't give tons of detail on all of them, but it did mention Benyong was called the reputed godfather of Chinatown crime in a New York Times obit.
Yeah, that tells you something about the darker side, doesn't it?
Definitely. And Dijon was connected to Nevada executions. Hints at some pretty serious consequences back in the day.
These names, they're like little windows into different aspects of the HSA's long history, the different roles people played.
And finally, just to underline their reach, the source lists all the cities where they had branches. It's not just New York and San Francisco.
No, it's quite a list. Boston, Chicago, LA, Seattle, Philly, Portland, and others too. Really shows you this was a national phenomenon.
Makes you wonder about the story in each of those cities.
For sure. Each branch probably has its own unique history, its own evolution.
Okay, so wrapping this up. We've seen the Hip Sing Association go from this early 20th century labor group born from a need for protection against prejudice.
Then getting into vice for funding, which led to the violent Tong Wars.
Then, surprisingly, deep into drug trafficking with some major connections in the mid-century.
And now, this really complex, uneven picture. Some branches moving towards being legitimate fraternal groups, especially in New York.
While others elsewhere still seem tangled up in crime, facing investigations and raids. It's still murky.
And the whole story, it really touches on bigger themes, you know.
Yeah.
The immigrant experience, how community groups can be both protective and problematic, the struggle to escape an illicit past.
Yeah, it makes you realize there are these hidden histories just beneath the surface in places you think you know.
Definitely. Layers upon layers.
It really leaves you thinking, seeing how differently the HSA chapters developed across the U.S., What does that say about how these kinds of organizations adapt or don't adapt, and how much does that old history still shape things today?
It's a fascinating question, isn't it? How they navigate change, legitimacy, community needs. It's ongoing.
Maybe something to explore further down the line, perhaps the Tong Wars in more detail, or some of these other figures, definitely a lot more to uncover there.